Hello, colleagues. Welcome. We're just having a few more people join in now. So welcome to the last in our series of webinars in the series Experiences in Digital Learning. This is the last one of this academic year. We will be kicking off with our fourth academic year from September, and we'll make sure that everybody knows what we've got lined up. It's lovely to read in the chat that we've got people from all over the world, which is very exciting. Means it's lots of different time zones. So some of us are on our lunch break and others are not. So a very warm welcome. I'm Dr. Linda Amran Cooper, and I'm Director of the Centre for Online and Distance Education at the University of London. And this series of webinars, Experiences in Digital Learning, started during COVID, as many good practices did. And we've been working with the Institute in Paris, the University of London's Institute in Paris, to coordinate these webinars across the last 3 years. I'm really pleased that we've got such an excellent lineup today, and I'm just going to pass you over now to our chair, Alexandra Mihai, and she's going to introduce you to our panel and to our topic today. I hope you very much enjoy the webinar. Please feel free to add things to the chat or to use the Q&A. We will record the event and share the recording, and we also have a colleague who writes a very helpful report on the event too, which we share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Linda, and thanks to everyone joining us. I'm also very excited to see all the different locations. It almost feels like we could pin it, all the locations on the map. That would be already quite a very nice, impressive picture. Today's topic is also very interesting, especially because we have two very different perspectives on one concept that is, I would say, maybe sometimes even overused today: sustainability. Now, sustainability can mean a lot of things. Of course, the more obvious ecological or environmental aspects are coming up immediately, but then there are lots of other directions in which you could interpret the term, all, of course, in our context, in relation to teaching and learning practices, in relation to using technology in teaching and learning. And that's why I'm delighted to really have two speakers that take two different angles to this. And I'm hoping we can encourage really nice discussion on either or both of those, but also how to maybe further interpret sustainability in your contexts, wherever you are based at the moment. So we have two speakers. First, we have Dominic. He's Senior Educational Technologist at City University of London, where he manages educational technology relationship with 3 schools. He's specialized in learning spaces, use of multimedia in teaching and learning design, and also co-hosts a very nice podcast, Teaching Here and There, about hybrid teaching and learning in higher education. And after that, we will have Eileen Kennedy, who is a principal research fellow at UCL Knowledge Lab, where she leads the MA in Education and Technology. She researches learning design from online and blended higher and professional education, including caring approaches to online pedagogy. And she will talk a little bit about that, I guess, today. But first of all, I'll give the floor to Dom. You'll have 15 minutes each, and then we'll have a 10-minute discussion for each presentation.
Thank you very much, Alex. So I think the first thing I'll do before I set my timer up is to share my screen in the hope that everyone can see that. I get a couple of nods there, so that gives me a bit of a clue. Okay, that's also enough to set up a timer so that I can get some notifications when I overrun. I can get some little prompts there, some haptic prompts. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to present at this session. I'm just double checking that I don't have a Zoom bar showing at the top of my screen, but I think I might do. Let me know if there's any issues with the slides themselves. The talk I'm going to give today is titled How Green is My EdTech? This is what I'm calling a think piece on digital education and the climate crisis. And it's something I've been starting to think about quite a lot over the past few years. And kind of the first time to step out in public and start sharing some of these thoughts. Now, the slides will be somewhat recently finished, so they're not as well referenced as they could be. I'll make sure that references go with the resources when they get sent out. Another warning as well to bring some environmental metaphors in early. My talks are usually a little bit open and sparse, like a prairie, but I think this one is probably going to be a bit denser, like a forest instead. So do bear with me if there's rather a lot of ideas in this as well. On the assumption that you can see this slide titled A Complex Changing World, this slide lists a series of trends, new technologies, social trends, some things that you may consider positive, some things you may consider negative, all of which are going to depend on your perspective. These are all a number of examples of things that are, I think, shaping our world today, many of which have emerged since I came into the world just a little over 50 years ago, and many of which I had never imagined when I was a kid. I put this slide up here just to demonstrate that we are in a time of profound change. I think that's something that everybody feels quite considerably. Second item on this list, of course, is the climate crisis, and that's what I'm mainly going to be addressing today. When you consider, if you consider the climate crisis, do you consider your glass to be half full, meaning that you see a way ahead, meaning that you have an optimistic view on a green future? Do you see it as half empty? Are you concerned about the rising temperatures, or do you not see the glass at all? There are many that don't as well. So for me, the glass is both perhaps half full and half empty, but it's very, very definitely there. Excuse me. So two different perspectives, one that we might consider as half empty and half full. On the left-hand panel, you see the latest example of one of the IPCC climate change reports. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out earlier this year, which states that human unequivocally, which is fairly rare even for climate scientists to be so bold and unequivocal in this statement. Human activities, principally through emissions of greenhouse gases, have unequivocally caused global warming, with global surface temperatures reaching 1.1 degrees above the pre-industrial age in the past 10 years, which is a rapid acceleration in global temperatures. On the other side of the picture, we get a comment from the International Energy Agency. Global energy crisis has triggered unprecedented momentum behind renewables, with the world set to add as much renewable power in the next 5 years as it did in the past 20. Nevertheless, that doesn't overshadow the exponential spike in global temperatures. You may see this if you search the hashtag #ShowYourStripes. You'll see a few of those on Twitter today. This is an indication of global temperature changes between 1850 and 2022. And as you can see, largely the 21st century has been totally characterized by everything heating up. Very familiar face here, and a simple message. Greta Thunberg, a year or two ago, stated, "Solving the climate crisis is the greatest and most complex challenge that Homo sapiens have ever faced. The main solution, however," she states, "is so simple that even a small child can understand it. We have to stop our emissions of greenhouse gases. I think that's, in many ways, that is a very simple message. We can argue whether there is a lot more complexity behind that point or not. But in many ways, there's a kind of a beauty to the simplicity of that message, I think. My personal perspective, let's see if I can move that a little bit as well. There we go. Is shaped around these three circles. The kind of future I'd like to see and try to play a part in, I hope to be one that will be considerably, let's call it, greener than it currently is. One I assume will continue to be more digital, but in a, shall we call it, net positive way. And one that is considerably more just on the social side of the coin than it is. I call this Venn diagram and the sort of sweet spot in the middle, transitionism, and believing in these three components as a better future makes me a transitionist. That's kind of my words, my thinking there. And the reason I share all of this stuff is it's increasingly my view. The more I feel the temperatures outside, the more I read the news, the more I see what goes on in different parts of the world, whether it's the floods in India or the smoke in New York from the Canadian wildfires, or the same wildfires happening in Australia. That I believe that this is the work of the rest of our lives, and it can feel astonishingly daunting if we go back to that Greta Thunberg quote of framing it as a species issue. It can feel incredibly daunting. Where on earth am I going to start in all this? Can I play a part? I think we can all play a part, and my hope with this talk is to try to bring the climate crisis into digital education, on distance and online education, and see what that means in this place. Try and unpack it a little bit, see if we can make a little bit of sense, and if that might help to think about where that places us as digital education professionals. So when we're talking about carbon emissions, they are typically divided into three buckets that are called scopes. These are scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by an organization. So you can see it might be a sort of company-owned vehicle, or the actual emissions of fossil fuels here. Scope 2 is more indirect, so it could be the heat from air conditioning system, electricity consumption, etc. And scope 3, which is generally the much bigger part, as I understand it, is everything that is associated with the activities of an organization, but isn't included in scope 2. So if we think about it in an academic context, business travel. So when an academic flies to a conference, that will be the carbon emissions from the flight will be included in scope 3 there. When students commute onto campus, for example, that would be included in scope 3. So if we talk about carbon emissions, we often think about maybe aviation or manufacturing or transport, these kind of things. Big industries where it's obvious to think about things like how much carbon gets put out in these sectors. IT, information and communications technology, hasn't really thought about this very much yet. It's beginning to in the past few years, but it's a struggle to find that many examples of the IT sector trying to calculate its emissions. There's a UK government. There was a UK government report that came out a few years ago, shortly before COVID, that calculated IT carbon as something between 4 and 6% of global emissions. And we think about data centers, communication networks, user devices, etc. And of course, there's also the future demands, which are ever rising. We have artificial intelligence, cryptocurrencies, the Internet of Things. Whatever comes next is bound to have a large environmental footprint as well. In the educational technology space, we obviously, user devices need power. This includes academics in their offices, student uses of mobile devices, labs, equipment. We have institutional infrastructure like video walls or digital signage. And then we obviously have, if we're taking that as an individual example of an institution, a university, for example, put all of that together, take an example like FutureLearn, where they partner with multiple other universities. Where do their scopes fall in? Do all the partners fall into their scope 3 emissions? It's an intensely complex thing to calculate. I'm part of a university called the City University of London, and there is universities love league tables. There is a league table by an organization called People and Planet, which is the only league table of UK universities that is ranked by environmental and ethical performance. Out of 153 universities, cities given a 2-1, which that's higher than my undergraduate grade, but I understand that it could still do a little bit better in that one. And these categories include environmental policies, ethical investments, the availability of sustainability staff, where it fits in the curriculum, etc. So the next slide, I'm going to give you an example of, I suppose, our footprint in the university in terms of the technologies that we use, each of which are going to have a range of different considerations for carbon. We're a Moodle university. Our learning management system, our virtual learning environment, has a range of associated other systems. We have a video platform from Kaltura, we have Echo 360, we have Turnitin, we have Anthology Ally. We use Teams and Zoom for our virtual classrooms. We use Poll Everywhere for our polling. We have Campus Press for our blogging platform. We make use of the wider Microsoft 365 environment. In our classrooms, we have all these teaching podiums, which have little control panels on them. And obviously, all of these have an energy component to them. All of them need to be powered. Now, I'm running a little bit tight on time, so I'm going to make sure I don't overrun too much. Let me cycle through these quickly. These are a few voices from the sector on kind of online versus in person as a few examples. My first time to see people actually talking about this very much, the environment question and EdTech or digital education, was a talk from Neil Selwyn at the University of Edinburgh last summer. The other papers I show on the screen here are other examples that have looked into comparing different course methods, so online versus in person. And interestingly enough, most of them seem to lead, despite the talk that Neil Selwyn gave last year about, it was a very glass half empty talk, but a lot of these other ones seem to look at the online education as providing, on balance, sort of more energy efficient than getting everybody onto campus, which is an interesting observation. But obviously, in all cases, more research is needed. There's a lot more research is needed. It's a very complex thing. A lot more research is needed. At COP26 a couple of years ago, there was a document put out called Mainstreaming Climate Education for Higher Education Institutions. I've hit my 15 minutes, so I'm just going to rattle through a little bit quickly here. You see highlighted some of the things that this sectoral body recommended for mainstreaming climate education here. So there's a lot of different examples that people are starting to look towards. JISC put out a report last year. UCISA had their first sustainability conference last month. An organization called EUAC, which is a charitable alliance for sustainability leadership in education, has put a standardized carbon emissions framework out for the sector. And of course, at the RIDE conference earlier on in March, where many of us met in person for the first time in a while, there were lots of really interesting examples of talks that were starting to address this as well, particularly in the online and distance space. A couple more things to end. Obviously, online and distance is one thing, the campus is another. There are some interesting examples out there of greener campuses. You know, can campuses generate their own energy to power their own activities? Sussex is an example of an institution that is aiming to become the most sustainable university in the world, or one of them. JISC also has a report on building the future intelligent campus, which has some very interesting ideas on efficient use of energy and resources, etc. And the final one from me as well is a few other sort of provocations. The first one, we had the Montreal Council of Parties, COP, last year as well, which was addressing the devastation of nature. And so long in climate and nature, these have been separated. Do we need to think about nature in the education space as well? We've long been talking about decolonizing the curriculum. Do we talk about decarbonizing the curriculum, or do we talk about greening the curriculum? And I'll just pick one more example there as well. Martin Weller's book, Metaphors of EdTech, talks about taking some other metaphors from environmentalism and talks about things like rewilding EdTech. Do we look at bringing more variety into our EdTech ecosystem? And I think these, the language we use around here is quite interesting. Finally, a pitch. I'll be on the radio tonight with a set of environmental songs, ttns.uk, 11 o'clock UK time, if anybody's interested. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting talk with a lot of, quite thought-provoking, at least from my side, because I do also hear these discussions emerging quite a bit more in the past months or so, and I'm sure you're going to see more of that. But I'm sure your ideas created some questions, so you could either write your questions in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask directly. Don't be shy.
This is also something to learn from the audience as well. Michael in the chat says, decarbonizing and decolonizing can go hand in hand. And this is a really valid point. I'm keen to put the two of them together, but I'm also mindful in the UK context as well, that to some extent that also culture warizes a certain concept. And do we want to go down that route, or does a term like greening make it more acceptable for wider adoption? I don't know, but it's a consideration.
Any questions or thoughts that you want to share with us also? Okay, perhaps some more thoughts will come until the end. So I would say let's move on to our second talk and really change angle. Somebody's just mentioning something. We have some questions now. You see, when you give a deadline, everyone starts asking questions.
So Natasha asks in the chat, what are some of the innovative ways universities are going more green that you've read? It's a great question. I mean, I try to make, I've got an example I pull out when I do the intelligent campus work with JISC. I try and imagine there's a technology called kinetic flooring, where you capture footfall. I was trying to imagine if campuses are much more active than they were in lockdown periods. We push everybody back onto campus again. Can you capture footfall as a way of generating power and use it to, a lecture theatre fills up and you use it to power the signage outside, for example. That's a little bit unusual, perhaps, but lots of different ways to do that. There's other nice examples as well. Eileen, you can come in as well. But also, I think is important things like partnering more with the communities that they're in. So things like building a connection with the local transport infrastructure. That's quite key as well. Eileen, were you going to come in?
Yeah. I just wanted to ask a question because you is it just energy that we need to be worried about with digital devices, for instance? I mean, isn't there the aspect of mining for precious metals and things like that, and all of the abuses potentially that go around that? I mean, that's quite disturbing too, isn't it? Has anyone sort of tackled that at all?
Yeah, it is, and it's one of those issues that I think is somewhat of a wicked problem. You can shift from point A to point B, but that move also is not risk-free or completely without its ethical challenges as well. You're right that moving away from carbon-intensive industries does have other extractive questions if you don't tackle those at the same time. My point of that Venn diagram earlier on is that these need to be considered simultaneously. If we are mining for rare earth metals to produce more batteries, what kind of impact is that having on the communities that the mines are in as well? So you're right. It's a question that needs dealing with as well.
Yeah, there are so many ramifications there, and somebody just mentions the reuse of equipment. Of course, recycling in that sense, not just throwing away stuff. And I guess we are doing that, but probably not enough. Definitely, making it more easy to do so. That would be nice to have schemes that allow that.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, reuse, recycle applies just as easily to digital education as it does to your shopping or your household items. That sort of stuff.
And it's a mindset thing as well. So yeah. But I think we're going to slowly move from the ecological sustainability to the emotional side of it, because yes, there is an emotional side of it, and we've seen quite a bit of it in the pandemic. Switching to online education really required a lot of emotional work as well, and that sometimes is not easy to measure or count in many ways, and also for institutions to support it, it can be quite a tricky thing. So I'm looking forward to Eileen's talk about that. Eileen, you have the floor.
Just to share my presentation. Sorry, I just can't find the little button because I've got other things. There we are. So, okay, so what I'm going to do in my presentation is to give you a little sense of the context of the research I've been doing for the last maybe around 6 years that's given rise to some of my thinking. And as Alex was just saying, sort of certainly that also came to into focus during the pandemic. And I want to talk about, I suppose, when Dom was talking about people and planets, I suppose what I'm interested in is the people bit, but also the planet bit, and how we can sort of keep everything going in a sense. So, as I say, I've just been researching for the last 6 years to think about how we can use collaborative online learning to work with people that are in challenging environments, and particularly when working with people in Lebanon, which is a country that's been affected by mass displacement, maybe more acutely than anywhere else in the world, but also recently other kinds of crises, including an energy crisis. To kind of find ways what we can do with digital education to address these things. And I suppose, we've just about to publish a book that talked about all of the different research that we've been doing over that time. And as you can see from the title there, we mentioned sustainability in the title. And I suppose, so the heart of the book is this idea of like how we could move from the idea of massive open online courses, which are not very good for teaching younger people, but, if we co-design them and make them collaborative learning experiences, they can be very good for professionals who need all of the different skills that we will increasingly need if we're going to address any of these sustainable development goals. And so, SDG 4, quality education, I think we could think really underpins every other aspect of that. And of course, we've created co-MOOCs in terms of community-based research, sustainable energy for communities, and in particular teaching, because one of the things about mass displacement is that, and we saw in Dom's list of all of these things that are happening at the big when at the first slide that he showed, displacement is caused by not just climate change, but a combination of things that maybe has climate involved in it, and it will continue to happen. And whenever that happens, we lose teachers. And there are more children that need education than there are teachers, and lots of people step into that role and then they need support. And so that's really where my research has been focused. Is like, how can we use digital education to sort of support the teachers who then could maybe also use digital education to support their learners, but like getting to them with our model of co-MOOC. And if we think why sustainability is really important in that context, I think that we can say, well, we can't, there's no point in aiming for anything less than long-term sustainability. And we know there's so many initiatives that have been started and then fizzle out because they're not sustainable. So we do have to think about sustainability in the round, I think. And it means that we've got to take a holistic approach to teaching online to understand its sort of wider impacts and avoid its negative effects. So just to say, what I've been doing then is to research with communities, take a design-based research approach to co-design what we call these co-MOOCs, these scaled-up collaborations between professionals to speed up their ability to respond to these changes that are coming about with the various crises that we're having to face and address. And then to try to blend those into existing maybe provisions for professional developments, like maybe within like an NGO that's providing education, maybe within a university, in order to sort of help make that process sustainable, because it's embedded within the community. And Dom also mentioned working with the community. So what's part of what we do is co-designing with professionals themselves and making the professionals the experts with that experience, interviewing teachers where they live and work. Here's an example, sort of going to an NGO school in Bekar and interviewing the teachers, because they're the ones, it's the professionals that are actually on the ground that have the real practical situated expertise that other people can learn from. So that's really the idea, and they that's how we create. And then we create collaborative activities in the co-MOOC so that other people can join, maybe different parts of the world, and share their expertise back. So we've got a theory of change that ends with, it starts with engagement, co-development, extending through a co-MOOC, embedding in local resources, and then ends with this goal of sustainability, because so that all of this research effort by everybody can kind of continue. So that's really important. And I want to give you an example of what I think is a really good outcome from some of this stuff is, you know, some of the teachers that we work with in the pandemic. Well, okay, so we work with an NGO called Jasur. Lots of their teachers were featured in our co-MOOC on transforming education in challenging environments. During the process of that co-MOOC, they obviously learned a lot about online learning. They knew quite a bit before. I mean, people do, you know, but what they also learned was learning design. That was one of the things that we focused on in that co-MOOC. The Jasur had problems with access to electricity. I mean, and so that they embedded some of the videos and so on, you know, within their own teacher training. So we got that kind of cycle going. But you know, come the pandemic, what was most important was to those teachers was a knowledge of their own learners, you know, the community, the context in which they lived, so that when they were thinking about how can we reach the learners with technology, they drew and they were confident about their understanding of learning design. They knew they could do it, but they also knew what would work in their particular context. So they created this program called Azima, and what it did really was to use WhatsApp to kind of communicate with the families of the children who might have just one mobile phone. They also shared paper resources if it was necessary, and so that they were kind of sharing the learning design. That the teachers would ask the children to do things. They do things at home, maybe in conventional ways, take a photograph, send it back to the teacher, get feedback and those sorts of things. So it was a way of creating a sustainable approach to education because they knew the context that they were working in. And I think one of the things that we want to kind of focus on here is that shows the power of teaching teachers about learning design. And that I think is one thing that we can all take away. So if we were to sort of just think about that, you know, how can we make our approach to learning, online learning, sustainable in the long term? I think, yes, we need to think about all of these green aspects. We also need to think about how we share expertise about how to design quality, contextualize, relevant learning experience for learners where they are. And that means co-designing with stakeholders. You know, that's the bit that's really going to change things, I think. And we need, therefore, to elevate the role of the teacher to become like a teacher researcher. They can find out about what's going to work in their context. And that is the thing that's going to help. But we also need to acknowledge, I think, the work that goes into teaching online, including what you might call the meta work of online teaching. I'll talk about that in a minute, and the emotional labor of online teaching, because actually these things are really hard to do and we don't acknowledge them, I don't think, enough. We also then need to take a costing approach that takes account of all of that stuff and isn't the traditional costing model of higher education, which tends to think every year the costs of teaching and learning are going to be the same, because they're not if you do it online. You know, because there's so much more upfront preparation needed. And what we also, and part of all of that, I think, is about the institution enabling teachers to care for the learners by providing contextualized quality learning, but also for the institution caring for the caregivers, the teachers and the support staff. And that is, you know, maybe about providing appropriate professional development, like a co-MOOC that actually helps them quickly get the skills that they need, rather than telling them to go on a long old course that they don't have time for. And maybe Azima's WhatsApp community of teachers, because they also use WhatsApp to support each other, is an example of that. I mean, thinking about these costs, you know, what we know is that it is a little bit different. If you're experienced with online learning, it takes a lot more work. It takes work up front. And everybody during the pandemic that I interviewed talked about what, not everybody, it was a big theme, like lots of people in the questionnaires, the surveys that we sent to staff. And, you know, when I've done, you know, presentations and stuff, people always say there's so much more work involved in teaching online. And there is, because it all comes up front. You've got to do more stuff. But what we could also start doing is not just acknowledging that work, but also seeing that there is an equivalent way in which we could improve a learning experience. So we're kind of balancing the costs of teaching online with the quality. So this is just like a graphic it's from the book that shows, you know, that you can, you know, a face-to-face lecture maybe doesn't require so much online preparation, but maybe it's not as good in terms of actually creating active learning for students, whereas it takes more time to prepare for online learning, but you can create a better experience with doing that. And of course, you know, I don't think any of that really came out, you know, sort of during the pandemic. People were just criticizing teachers for not doing more, when of course they were doing so much more actually, and they were creating good experiences. But the point is that even if you spend more time, after in the first run, thereafter, the time that you take gets less and less. And so the idea that this thing is something that you can create and then sustain over multiple runs is very important. And I mean, you know, I've been talking about this for a little while, and, you know, we created quite a long time ago a tool to help people cost online teaching, to take account of that balance, and it's still available, the CRAM tool. But it's interesting that we went some way at UCL to actually institutionalizing this, but then it kind of fizzled out and it didn't really come back, and it should do. And I think we do need this kind of approach if we're going to really change things and help teachers, because the cost, the kind of costs, the additional costs there are for teaching and learning online are all kinds of things. You have to, you know, respond more quickly maybe to students, because there's something about, like, if you don't have a response online, everyone thinks, you know, they're on their own completely. You have to deal with anxieties caused by the technical aspects, by isolation. Maybe you have to find different ways of interaction, because everybody wants you know, that it's difficult. The teachers say that it's very difficult to teach when the cameras are off and you don't know who you're talking to, and that creates an awful lot of emotional labor, and it's quite tough. And if we don't really acknowledge these things, it can cause burnout. And lots of people have pointed out, and you know, sort of in my co-authors and I in various publications have said, you know, this is invisible labor often, and it's often very highly gendered labor. But I also want to introduce another concept here, which I've come across recently, like the idea of meta work, which is work that enables work, or work that, you know, makes work go well, i.e. all the work you have to do in order to do your job. Like, for instance, you know, when you're teaching online, finding a technology that's going to work, you know, in order to, you know, get students to interact when they don't want to put the camera on or put their mic off. That takes an awful lot of work. If I've got time, this is an extract from interviews that my colleagues and I conducted over the pandemic. And it's the case of somebody who was quite junior. Well, I shouldn't say that really, because no, you know, who was a researcher actually, and was new to teaching. And she talked about her experience of teaching online with all the cameras being off as being really horrible. You know, like, that's so extreme, isn't it? Like, it was an awful experience for her, because she didn't know their names. She couldn't use the techniques that she used to use to sort of engage people. And she talks about the Q&A being stressful, that she was talking to a picture of herself, and you know, she was just waiting for the clock to go by. Now, that kind of experience, and I also want to point out here that she had to create a pre-recorded lecture, so there was additional work like that. So presumably, if she'd never done it before, she had to learn how to create a pre-recorded lecture, and then, you know, that she had to deal with well, that was part of dealing with the rubbish internet, because that wasn't being provided for her. So you know, when our technology is not provided for us, it causes us much more work. And you know, somebody who experiences something like this is not going to leap to do it again, are they? You know, I mean, so unless, what happened during the pandemic is many people developed much more knowledge, you know, and then they kind of managed to find a way so it wasn't quite such a trauma. But the thing about technology is that it changes, so it's always going to involve this stuff. It's all, I mean, at the moment we're all scrabbling around trying to think about how we're going to use AI tools, or you know, how that's going to change everything. So so you know, this kind of meta work is about finding the right technologies to provide interaction, and I found that the institutions during pandemic were finally actually providing us with the tools, and governments were finally acknowledging and crediting programs. But you know, I see that there's been a bit of rollback in that, and that's the problem. We need to provide the teachers with what they need. People need to learn to use technologies, and it needs to be in a flexible way to make it easier to lessen the amount of extra work they do. And we need to find workarounds for technologies that don't work. Just quickly, and I think I'm over time, but Tronto has talked about different registers of care, and this is sort of some work that Martin Oliver, my colleague's been leading, that have focused on. Thinks about these 4 registers of caring, like the political dimensions of caring, and they're quite useful, I think, to thinking about who's doing what, who's caring about what, who's the teacher caring about, who's the institution caring about, and what the gaps are. So you know, and they're like caring about, so recognizing need, deciding, you know, that should be met, whether you take care of that person, actually assume responsibility is a different aspect of caring. Caregiving is actually doing the caring, and then care receiving is giving feedback to the caregiver. Now, if we go back to the Amy horrible experience here, you can see that she's caring about her learners. She's also caring about herself. She feels that her needs are not really being met there by the institution. And you know, and what's interesting, I think, is that she's really taking responsibility in many ways for dealing with things that you might have thought the university should take responsibility for, like, you know, providing her with the infrastructure she needs. And in the interviews, when we went back and reanalyzed interviews we'd done with teachers over the pandemic, we found that there were these gaps, you know, like that certain people expected care from other people, like support staff, but there was very little evidence of people taking responsibility for the caring for those people. So this is a way we could kind of use, we could hold institutions to account. And then, so, you know, like, just to finish, I think that if we're going to work towards a sustainable model of teaching with technology, we need to really think about that co-design of digital education. In crisis situations, forever, people have been, you know, sort of parachuting in technologies or suggesting technologies that don't really take account of the needs of the contextualized needs of those particular learners, or the teachers themselves who know about those contextualized needs. And that's the bit that we've got to make sure. We've got to think the teacher is central to all of this teaching with technology. And we've got to sort of raise the status of teachers, think about them as teacher researchers who can find out what the needs of their learners, and so that they can design use learning design for their learners and take care of them through that contextualized learning design. And then I think from the institutions part, we've got to acknowledge these upfront and ongoing labor that's involved, including emotional labor and this invisible meta work of teaching online, so that we prepare for it. And that could mean adopting a different costing model to balance those costs of and learning benefits of online teaching, maybe using something like the CRAM tool or, you know, a variant of that, in order to make sure, I think that the institution is really taking responsibility to care for the needs of the caregivers so that they can do all of this other stuff. So I suppose, I think the thing is, you know, there's lots of dimensions to that, and maybe that's just sort of a different perspective on sustainability.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eileen. Indeed, that was very, very interesting, and you kind of opened our eyes to quite a new dimension, or quite a few new dimensions. And I really appreciated the fact that you mentioned the idea of institutions supporting or needing to support teachers and students, of course, in different ways. Of course, we support them pedagogically, we can support them with technology, but there is this sometimes hidden or seemingly implicit, but not always, aspect of emotional support, and maybe also who is really, you know, trained to give that, and how. And I think there's so many, you know, important things to think about. Do we have any direct questions? Thanks to some colleagues who posted some resources. Yeah, thanks a lot. Any questions to Eileen?
Just to come in with an observation and maybe partly a question. I think what we observed is that there has been to some extent a conflation with you know, what happened in the pandemic with COVID and teaching online, and an unfortunate kind of, you know, and the experience of that. So I think that has been unfortunate. I think but what you're really sort of pulling out here, I think really well, is that kind of additional. I think it will happen in in-person environments as well, but I think because of some of the challenges around technology where cameras aren't on, there's that additional kind of level, and it's different, isn't it? And you need to adapt your expertise appropriately to be able to cope with teaching and learning in that environment. And I don't know whether you've got anything you wanted to sort of add about that, because it is different, isn't it? And it has lots of affordances. Online has lots of affordances that you don't have in person, and vice versa. And I think it's acknowledging those two and the differences, and that each have their strengths and their weaknesses. Each has their pros and cons.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but I suppose one of the things that in terms of sustainability, the flexibility that online or maybe blended or hybrid teaching and learning experiences provide are going to be required, you know, again, I mean, and they already are. I mean, there's all sorts of things that people are going through at the moment, you know, where that makes it difficult for people to come to class. You know, in Lebanon, for instance, online teaching just before the pandemic was a solution to the sort of anti-government riots. People couldn't travel safely to their universities. And then now, you know, with energy crisis, internet crisis, it's, you know, some of the universities, well, Lebanese university is largely teaching without energy at all, you know, beyond 2 hours a day. So, you know, online learning is the kind of thing that we could plug into, you know, sort of to maintain, to sustain, you know, education. And we need education for all of those sustainable development goals. I also think, I don't know what, you know, it'd be interesting to hear your perspectives on this, is that what happened with the pandemic is that there was, I don't know, you know what, the teacher, this is the thing, the teacher knew, you know, what they needed, and yet the tools that were often being made available were not good enough. You know, I mean, there was a massive change during the pandemic, but I just think that the teacher needs to be much more central to making decisions about what technologies that, you know, are required for all of these things. And when I say technologies are nothing without a teacher. So it's sort of technology, pedagogy, it's that kind of thing. And I think maybe for too long we've kind of separated them out, you know, and they need to be brought back together. And I mean, I haven't really had much experience of procurement of technologies, but the little experience I had, that I found that the kind of decisions that people were making around which technologies to buy, you know, were nothing to do with the experience of teaching and learning with those technologies. It was on something else. I'd like to hear what Dom says about that. But I don't think that's sustainable, because if we're going to take advantage of this, I think we need these tools, you know, we need the proper tools, and maybe that goes for the development of them in the first place.
I'll just respond to that point on the procurement question as well. I mean, I have sat in on some procurement issues, and I've had some friends colleagues rather, who have been quite involved in it. And part of our participation in the procurement process is really to advocate for the teacher. You know, we are sort of proxy advocates to make sure that it's not just considered as well, that's cheaper and therefore it's the right technology to use. We recently had a procurement run for polling tools, and had really extensive requirements gathering from staff, and made sure all of that fed in. And we listened to IT as well, made sure that their considerations were fed in. And it's a lot of work, but it means that if you join up all the dots and the different components of professional services, then you have a much sort of wider view on what's the right tool to get.
Yeah, I just think there's a bit of a battle though there, and I wonder also about, you know, sort of, you've got a learning technologist, you know, sort of standing in for the teacher, and the teacher should be there really also, you know. And the trouble is, of course, teachers probably don't, you know, they don't want to be there because it's another thing that they have to do. They don't want to have to do that work as well, do you know? So it's very difficult, isn't it? But I think that we do need to change our approach, because it makes all the difference. That's the thing. It just completely makes all the difference. There's no point providing us with tools that nobody uses, which I think, you know,
happens all too often. Yes, unfortunately. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Last question, I would say, or comment.
There's a comment from Matteo in the chat. The time and effort put into co-designing technologies needs to be formally recognized. Yes.
Yeah, there are many things that need to be structurally changed as well, but it's really nice to hear those more nuanced implications of using technology in teaching and learning, because as you see now, it ranges from procurement, from getting those technologies, who is there at the table when we discuss about that, up to how we use them, how we provide support for teachers and students using them. And there are quite a lot of implications that are worth thinking about. So we have a question in the chat.
I think that one's for Eileen.
Well, have teachers been cared for in the past? Well, have they, is the question. You know,
it's a new problem.
Indeed.
Yeah, well, it's not a new problem. People have talked, you know, I think though, I suppose what maybe when we start thinking about, I mean, teachers, it goes up and down how valued people feel and how good an institution is. I think there is just this additional workload, which is, I mean, like, again, you know, sort of emotional labor is nothing new for teaching, but like, you know, sort of, there's an awful lot of that goes on within online teaching in a different way, an additional amount of work. And I think that this kind of meta work thing, ever since I've been introduced to that, you know, you see it everywhere, and no wonder people get stressed. Do you know what I mean? No wonder people feel burnt out, because we're having all the time to learn new stuff just to do what we have to do. And that's, you know, I don't think that that is sustainable really. So that's what maybe what we should say we've learned, you know, we're working really hard, you know. We're working extreme. No, not that everybody missed that part, but you know, it's sort of it's I don't know, and I really hope your institutions are just building and building on what we learned, but I don't know if they all are looking at my own.
Yeah, indeed, it's very context dependent, and I think every institution is approaching it a bit differently. But we can only hope, and let's end on this rather hopeful note. Thanks, Eileen, Dom, for very interesting and thought-provoking talks, and also thank you everyone for your interest and questions. We will send the recording in about a week or so. Also for those of you who couldn't join, but those of us who couldn't join. But still, thanks a lot. And this was the last webinar of the Experiences in Digital Education series, and as Linda said in the beginning, we'll be back next in autumn with a new series, and I will keep you posted about the dates. Thank you everyone. I would say have a good holiday, but not yet probably for most of us, but from our side, and looking forward to seeing most of you next academic year. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.